Thank you very much for your introduction and kind words. Just to correct, I didn't fly from Israel to California and took a shower. I flew from California to Israel and took a shower. I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for everybody who joined us. And today's session is going to delve into that term, that concept that is called Israel. Which, like many terms, is a term, of course, in our world is often used, and sometimes without much clarity as to its meaning. Obviously, for us, when we say Israel, we say the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the Torah of Israel, the state of Israel. But what I would like to do today is really give you a well-contextualized understanding of the evolution of that term, so we can understand that when we talk about Israel, I would argue all the landscapes, all these conceptual landscapes, which I will introduce today, are interwoven with one another and assist in shaping both our understanding and many a time our confusion and different or diverse narratives regarding Israel. So basically, I would argue that when we talk about Israel, there are five distinct yet interrelating conceptual landscapes that we need to understand, and we will unpack them all. And in order to start our journey, we will go to the first paragraph from the founding document of Israel's establishment, the Scroll of Independence, which, by the way, is a document that I recommend that every Jew reads, as it harbors a language that unpacks a lot of the characteristics of our shared narrative. And this is what Israel's Declaration of Independence says in its first paragraph. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, create cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. So interestingly enough, the first words in the State of Israel's Declaration of Independence are the words, the land of Israel, Be'eretz Israel. And why does the Scroll of Independence of the State of Israel start with the word, the land of Israel? And here indeed, we need to understand the intrinsic relationship between the concept of the land of Israel way before we get to the state of Israel, which will be the number 4 landscape in our list. So when we start trying to unpack the land of Israel, we have to understand 3 distinct landscapes which inform, and fascinatingly so, its place and role. And the first landscapes which we need to explore is what I call Israel as an imagined land. Interestingly enough, and Ari, if we can scroll down a little bit. If we follow the biblical narrative, our foundational texts, we find something quite fascinating. The Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, which comprise the Torah, or in fact, if you think about it, are comprised of 4 plus 1. Why do I say 4 plus 1? Because you have the first book of the Pentateuch, and the 5th one, Dvarim, Deuteronomy, basically sums up the other 4 and brings the people to the threshold of entering the land of Israel. The fascinating thing, however, in the Pentateuch, if you think about it, is that the entire relationship between the people of Israel or those who will be called the people of Israel, and that land of Israel, all the details pertaining to that land, all the information about that land, all the intrinsic connection between those people and that land, all of those details actually appear, if we follow the Torah, they appear, they are outlined, they are unpacked, not in Israel, but rather in Sinai. In that respect, the people of Israel receive a very detailed understanding of a land which they have not yet experienced. In that respect, the first major interaction of the people of Israel with the land of Israel is an imagined relationship. Israel is therefore forged into our collective memories, first and foremost, as an imagined land. And if you actually want to understand what kind of a land, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 10 actually sums it up quite succinctly, as it says, for the land where you go into inherit it, and remember, this is being said to the people of Israel in Sinai, is not as the land of Egypt from whence you came out. It is a land which the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year, even unto the end of the year. In other words, God establishes the land of Israel as a land which is unlike any other geography that the people of Israel may know, in this case, Egypt, and renders the land of Israel what I would call a theography. A theography, by the term theography, I mean a land, and we will unpack this in a minute, which has an intrinsic relationship with the God of Israel, and therefore expects an intrinsic relationship with the people of Israel. In other words, if we want to borrow from more modern literature, and not necessarily Jewish, we should think about the land of Israel as Narnia. Narnia, which is dubbed by C.S. Lewis as a land of deep magic, a land that does not abide by the same rules and regulations of other geographies, in our case, Egypt, from whence you came, but rather now obeys a whole set of rules, regulations, expectations, which are intrinsic to this triangle, which we come to know as the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel, which are now all three being negotiated through the Torah of Israel. In that respect, Israel as an imagined land is a foundational motif in our joint narrative, and it carries its thrust literally until the very moment the Torah ends and the books of the prophets begin, namely with the first one, with the book of Joshua, that now leads, as the predecessor of Moses, leads the people from a state of imagined land to the second landscape, which we will now encounter, which is Israel as a covenantal land, Eretz Habrit. And here I want to quote one of the greatest Jewish historians of the 20th century, Arthur Hertzberg, who says the following thing: the land of Israel is a central point in the covenant, Habrit, between the people of Israel and God. It is a land which had been set aside for the authentic encounter between the seed of Abraham and the God who founded their community. Let's continue scrolling down. This land was fashioned by God for a particular service of God, that its very landscape should help mold the character and spirit of God's beloved people. Now, this abstract depiction by Arthur Hertzberg can be unpacked. In this session, will be unpacked through understanding three covenantal rights that actually demonstrate very tellingly the unique standing of the land of Israel as a covenantal land. And the first one is the covenantal right of Shabbat. As it happens, we just embarked here in Israel on a Shnat Shemitah. Shnat Shemitah, a year that is celebrated every 7 years, where the land is let go. The word lishmot, Shemitah, is to let go of the land and to allow the land to rest every 7th year as part of that covenantal right. However, interestingly enough, the word Shemitah, which we all use, appears only once in the Torah, and it appears in the book of Deuteronomy. But the laws of Shemitah, the fundamental laws of Shemitah that are being given in full detail to the people of Israel, again, not in Israel, but in Sinai, appear in the book of Leviticus chapter 25, and look at the language which is being used here. And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, excuse me, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath unto the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be for food for you. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we're not simply talking about allowing the land to rest, but rather the Torah commands the Israelites to allow the land of Israel to keep the Sabbath every 7th year, just like a Jew is expected to keep the Sabbath every 7th day. And if you follow the Torah, later on you'll see that the Torah now says if you will not allow the land to do so, in other words, if you will not allow the land to keep the Sabbath as I command the land to do through your mediation as humans, as Hebrews, as Jews, the land shall kick you out. It will vomit you out. You will be exiled, expelled from this land, for you have not allowed it to enter into a covenant with me. In other words, the land itself has an independent covenant with God as the land of Israel, and the people of Israel are expected to allow the land to keep its covenant. An interesting second rite of passage is the rite of passage which we know as Milah, or Brit Milah, the covenant of Milah, which is the covenant of circumcision. And here, again, if you are sensitive to the Hebrew original, you see that the word uncircumcised, or arel in Hebrew, appears in a number of instances in the biblical narratives. Number one, of course, is the uncircumcised, the Gentile, the one who does not enter into a covenant of circumcision that started with Abraham. So, of course, somebody who is not a Jew in the biblical narrative is arel. In other words, someone whose male genitals have not been circumcised. That's the most known. Another rendition of circumcised is someone whose mouth is uncircumcised. And this rendition appears in prophetic language, where prophets say about themselves that they cannot adequately render the word of God to people because they feel that they are of uncircumcised tongue, or sometimes prophets who render that condition to other nations and call them people of uncircumcised lips or tongues. The third is someone of an uncircumcised heart, which, by the way, would become the main concept for the abolishing of actual circumcision by early Christians who would understand that they're entering into a new covenant with God is through the circumcision of the heart rather than the physical act of circumcision of the male sex organ. But there is one more rendition of circumcision which pertains to the land of Israel, and only to the land of Israel. In Leviticus chapter 19 says the following: when you shall come into the land and shall have planted all manners of trees for food, then you shall count the fruit thereof as, in the English, forbidden, in the Hebrew, as arelim, as uncircumcised. 3 years shall it be as uncircumcised unto you, it shall not be eaten. The law continues there to say, on the 4th year, you're allowed now to give it as sacrifice to the holy temple, and only on the 5th year, you can render it edible. In other words, the fruit of the tree of the land of Israel is rendered uncircumcised until it follows the ritual of being given as sacrificial offerings in the temple, undergoing a covenantal rite in the temple, and only then it is rendered circumcised and therefore permissible to be eaten by the people of Israel. And the third is probably the one that is the most prevalent and the most dramatic, and that is, of course, tzedakah. Now here I just want, in very briefly, unpack that word tzedakah, which a lot of the times is being understood as either acts of loving kindness, or in the early Christian rendition, acts of charity. Tzedakah, in fact, is much more than that. And again, by way of very brief contextualization, I would say that tzedakah, which is the number one aspect of prophetic interest in the Bible, this is the one thing that bothers prophets more than anything else. Tzedakah is understood as the obligation to bring society, by and large, into some sort of harmonious utility before the law and before God on all aspects, not only economical, human dignity, gender relations, treating the world, treating the landscape, treating animals, treating your children, treating the poor, whomever it may be, to dignify human beings and to humble those who perceive themselves as those who are vain or those who are tyrants. So tzedakah is a major concern of the biblical narrative, and the land of Israel as a covenantal land is expected to take an active part in the act of, or in the acts of tzedakah. So here are a number of examples. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corner of your field, neither shall you gather the gleaning of your harvest. You shall leave them to the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And here is in Deuteronomy, beware that there be not a base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release. This is the verse where in the Hebrew comes the word Shemitah, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your needy brother, and you give him nothing. And he cries unto the Lord against you, and it shall be considered a sin in you. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about Israel as a covenantal land, we are talking about a theography which is expected to abide by particular covenantal rights as a Jewish land, and by doing so, be a land that now corresponds with the Jewish people as they correspond with the laws given to them by the God of Israel. This is why This is why we in fact have 2 Talmuds and not 1. Whenever a rabbi or a teacher, a professor or a fellow student tells you the Talmud says, you should immediately stop them and ask which one, because we in fact have 2. We have the Israelite Talmud, aka Palestinian Talmud, aka Jerusalemite Talmud. These are all the same Talmud, which was composed circa the 4th and 5th centuries in the Galilee, Tiberias and the Galilee. And we have its humongous brother, which was composed about a century later in Babylon and aptly known as the Babylonian Talmud. Why 2 Talmudim, ladies and gentlemen? By and large, the Babylonian Talmud deals with almost every aspect of Jewish law. The Israelite Talmud deals primarily with mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz, mitzvot which are contingent upon residing in Israel and being in Israel. Why? Because being in Israel constructs a set of mitzvot that are endemic to this theography. The land of Israel as a covenantal land continues to carry its thrust throughout our biblical narrative until we are faced with the first expulsion to Babylon, and then the second expulsion, which we face in the Roman period. And there we move now from Israel as a covenantal land to Israel as a remembered land. And that element, that configuration in our shared narrative is carried until, for many of us, until today. And indeed, the concept of remembering the land of Israel as a covenantal landscape carries through our shared narrative throughout over 3,000 years of exile. Usually we talk about 2,000 years of exile, but that's actually historically not accurate. There are many diasporas around the world for whom the exile of Israel has taken place over a millennia earlier. So we're talking 3,000 years of exilic narrative, which now brings forth a land of Israel, which is deemed a land of memory. And here are a few examples. Rabbi Judah Halevi, the famous philosopher and poet from the 11th and 12th century, comes and says very succinctly, the Jewish people cannot truly cleave to the divine cause save in the land of Israel. And he's here in the book of Kuzari, he's referring to the covenantal land, which plays an active role. The legendary Maimonides says, uprooting the people of Israel from their land is analogous to uprooting them from their very distinction as a nation. Or in other words, one cannot divorce between the people of Israel and the land of Israel in that covenantal paradigm. Rabbi Judah Leib ben Betzalel, aka the famous Maharal of Prague. Some of you may have heard of him through the famous Golem of Prague, says the following thing: only upon entering the land of Israel did the Jewish people truly become a nation, unified as one people in a single place, devoted to them by God. Again, alluding to that covenantal paradigm. And some words from the recently late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of England. The land of Israel remained the focus of Jewish hopes. Wherever Jews were, they built synagogues, each of which was a symbolic fragment of the temple in Jerusalem. Wherever they were, they prayed about Jerusalem, facing Jerusalem. They remembered it and wept for it, as the psalm had said, at every time of joy. They never relinquished their claim to the land, and there were places, especially in the north, meaning the north of Israel, which they never left. The Jewish people was the circumference of a circle at whose center was the Holy Land and Jerusalem, the holy city. These are obviously very romantic renditions of Israel, because what happens here, and we see it through the millennia of exilic existence of the people of Israel, Israel's physical presence of absence, namely the fact that one does not reside in Israel, Israel's physical presence of absence now gives rise to a plethora of romantic, imaginative, poetic, literary, theological, mystical renditions that aim to basically confront that physical absence with a spiritual yoke, with a theological yoke. Memory and the perpetuation of memory of the land of Israel becomes the redemptive narrative of an exilic nation. In other words, the land of Israel remains the homeland, irrespective of the lands which are now our homes. That is a very Jewish, obviously, perspective of the land, which is induced by the covenantal landscape, by the imagined landscape, by the evolution of the narrative up to that point. But if you juxtapose that narrative, which is obviously romantic and glorified, as it should be, with people who do not share in that narrative because they're not Jewish or they're not familiar with it, such as the famous Mark Twain, let us juxtapose those romantic and beautiful and glorified rendition of Remembered Israel with an actual, much less romantic view of that land of Israel in the mid-19th century, just a few years before the Zionist movement will arise on a world scene. And this is what Mark Twain writes while he visited Israel. The further we went into the land, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. This land is desolate and unlovely. And why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? This land is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. No one, of course, denies that in the mid-19th century, major parts of the land of Israel were in such a condition. But that is precisely the beauty of what I was trying to show here. There is another level of memory that has a vision that transcends the sight. In other words, the perpetuation of Israel's memory tries to overcome the growing distance of the Jewish people from that landscape through long diaspora living. That being said, however, one should note that Israel as a remembered land was not necessarily remembered as such by all Jews in the same manner. When we actually look at the way Israel was remembered or commemorated, we find a plethora, diverse views from those who preached day in and day out that one's Jewish identity cannot be fulfilled. One's Jewish destiny cannot be fulfilled until one actually relive days of old and reclaim that land again. In other words, returning to that covenantal paradigm, up to a point of people who said no, such as, for example, Dubnov, who basically preached for Israel's importance in the Jewish mindset exactly as a mythical configuration, and basically continued to preach for the continued existence, nay, the necessity of a Jewish continued existence spread throughout the world. In other words, different Jews perceived the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel on different planes. From those who said, we will not fulfill our destiny until we reverse that condition and come back to the land physically, literally rebuild that land of old, and those who say, no, we have learned that the mythical, romantic, commemorative properties of the land, semi-mythical properties of the land are what we need, and our physical existence needs to be continued in the various lands which are our home. These different views of Israel have also become the founding blocks of the Zionist movement, which again has many branches, many interpretations. In that respect, ladies and gentlemen, there is no such a thing as a Zionist movement in the singular, but there is a Zionist idea which have brought forth different movements conversing with one another until this very day that we are talking right now. What is important to our discussion is that the rise of the Zionist movement in Europe towards the third quarter of the 19th century was the initiatory step to move from a remembered land to the fourth landscape, which is Israel as a lived land. And that would become, of course, the state of Israel. But before we go to that, a very important distinction that we should make when we talk about Zionism. Because unfortunately, Zionism has become a word that is being abused, manipulated. Many people thrive on other people's ignorance concerning Zionism. And that ignorance, unfortunately, runs rampant not only among anti-Israel movements, but also among many of our own brothers and sisters among the Jewish people. So here I want to offer for further discussion and thought what I believe is a crucial distinction when we talk about Zionism, and that is Zionism as an ancient Jewish value versus Zionism as a modern Jewish movement. Whoever talks about Zionism solely as a movement that was constructed since Theodor Herzl's vision ex nihilo in Western Europe in mid-19th century is wrong. Because the Zionist movement has absolutely no raison d'etre, has no reason for existence or justification of existence without understanding that Zionism is first and foremost 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, 3,000 years value. And that value of Zionism is based precisely on the three landscapes which I have outlined to you before. Israel is an imagined land, Israel is a covenantal land, and Israel as a remembered land. Abraham and Abraham's relationship with God and movement to Israel is based on a Zionist idea. So is Moses. So are the Israelites. So is Joshua. So are the kings and the prophets. So are Ezra and Nehemiah, who returned from Babylon, leading a movement that was called Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. So are Ezekiel, who sits in Babylon and laments on the rivers of Babylon. We remember Zion and wept. So is the name of the city Tel Aviv, which actually appears in the book of Ezekiel as he remembers Zion. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that Zionism as a movement was founded from beginning to end on the understanding of Zionism as an ancient Jewish idea and an ancient Jewish value. And indeed, based on that, when we look at Israel's declaration of independence, we see what Ben-Gurion says, and this is probably the most famous tractate that people know because it usually appears also on videos and on YouTube. And I'll read it in the Hebrew and then translate to the English. לפיכך נתכנסנו אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל, ובתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל. And now when we unpack this, we see everything that I talked about. Accordingly, we, members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled by virtue of our natural and historic right that pertains now to the landscapes which I've just conveyed to you and the intrinsic relationship between the people of Israel to that imagined covenantal and remembered landscape. That's one, the Eretz Israel. And based on the UN resolution, in other words, now they're pertaining to the Zionist movement and the modern political language which gives rise to the state of Israel. They're talking about both the land of Israel and the state of Israel. And now look what they say. We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the state of Israel, Medinat Israel. Not a state for Jews, not a state with a Jewish majority, not a state to be inhabited by Jews, but a Jewish state. This now, the very rendition of a Jewish state, brings with it also profound challenges, which are basically also a reason for another lecture altogether. Some people argue that the term Jewish state is a violation of the separation of church and state principle, which was constructed, as we all know, on January 1801, the erection of separation of a wall of separation between church and state by the founding fathers of the United States of America, and then later on adopted by other Western countries. That could be true only if we regarded Jewish as a religion alone. Obviously, I hope you understand by this point that we are not looking at a Jewish state as pertaining only to the religious aspect of the state, but rather to its very identity as a state that has a relationship with the evolving Jewish narrative. So arguably, a separation of church and state in its dogmatic or conventional setting from other liberal Western democracies is going to be highly challenging to play out in an Israeli context. That is not to say that separation of certain religious dogma and civil issues should be discussed, and it is discussed. But arguably, a separation that is based on a separation of religion and state alone is too simplified a doctrine to be applied from A to Z in the Israeli context, because this is obviously a unique context. The second point, of course, that we need to unpack here is, what does that mean to have a Jewish state vis-a-vis its relationship and obligations to non-Jewish citizens of that state? And that is another profound question. Because if we talk about a Jewish state, does that mean that the Jewishness of that state comes forward in its, let's say, symbols, national symbols, such as the menorah, the flag which harbors a Magen David, the national anthem, which is obviously Jewish, and so on and so forth. But other than that, it should be a completely equal state to all of its citizens, which obviously is derived from its aspiration to be democratic. Or are we talking about something different? This is also part of a profound discussion that continuously takes place in Israeli and Jewish discourse between Jews themselves and between Jews and non-Jews, both within Israel and outside of Israel. So the questions that relationship between Jewish, which now nurtures the identity from a narrative that is millennia old, and democratic, which is a much more modern configuration, and the aspiration to join them both means that Israel, the state of Israel, has to face some very, very profound challenges, which are part and parcel of its raison d'etre and its trajectory. And that indeed leads me to the fifth landscape, which in my opinion is the most important and on which I have nothing to say, but rather share with you a big question mark. And that is Eretz HaChazon. Israel is an envisioned land. Where do we see Israel going? Accepting that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, and not only the homeland of the Jewish people who live in Israel. That's important point number one. Where do we see Israel's role in shaping the relationship between Israelis and worldwide Jewry? Where do we see the place of Israel in allowing Israelis and offering infrastructure for Israelis to learn much more in depth about world Jewry and its significant role in allowing Israel to transform from a remembered land to a lived land? The place and role of world Jewry, let alone American Jewry, in this historical saga is nothing short of crucial and inspirational. And I argue that in today's day and age, we are entering an era where the relationship between Jews of Israel and world Jewry must become much more reciprocal, and that Israelis, first and foremost, must become much more knowledgeable and understanding of the rich diversity and the assets that world Jewry has to offer about Jewish identity, Jewish communal life, Jewish vitality, as much as world Jewry needs to continue its engagement with Israel, with all of its assets and all of its challenges. I will end here, and Ari, the stage is back to you to
Thank you. Thank you so much. We did a program about different forms of Zionism a few weeks back, and this, what you've now given us, is the prequel. The prequel. So I like that with CSP. It's a spiral learning. We've done so many programs that our programs start to build on each other and give background or further our discussion. So people in the audience, feel free to start chatting your questions. Here are a few things. I would say, well, someone asked just a straightforward question. Do people in Israel today still follow the sabbatical year? And the answer is yes, but does Israel as a country follow it, or is it certain people within the country that do it?
The latter. There are certain areas that maintain Shnat Shemitah, and they actually publish it. So you will, if you travel in Israel, you may come across, most likely you will come across certain fields in agricultural areas from the road that you can see that have a sign, a big sign, Kan Shomrim Shnat Shemitah. This is a place that observes Shnat Shemitah. There are certain rabbinic Orthodox rulings that pertain to Shnat Shemitah, but they are not part of the official law of the land as a whole.
So a bigger question, because really what you've given us is the big question. It's the high view of all the things that we talk about and we see in the news. You know, you've given us the background, and it seems ironic that you mentioned the triangle of God, the land, and the people of Israel. Let's take God out of it for a second, and this intrinsic relationship and the 3,000 years of this relationship between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And the reality is what seems to have happened when Israel, no longer was an imagined land, but a lived land, is that now there's a divorce happening, and that, we see it in many ways. In America, we see young people who are divorcing themselves from the land of Israel, and because of Zionism and the politics of Zionism. And then in Israel, I think we see Israelis who are divorcing themselves from the people of Israel. And like, are Israelis, for example, one of the questions are, do many Israelis see themselves as part of a world Jewish community, or are they really Israelis? So can you comment on that challenge, that it seems like the reality of creating the land, which everybody probably in this audience supports, that there is a land of Israel, has now created a massive break in the Jewish world, has it not?
That's a very, very big question, and I'm actually going to refer to it much more thoroughly, Ari, on the third lecture of this series, when I talk about the assets and challenges of 21st century Jewish and Israel education. But I don't want to leave you and the audience wanting on this issue. So I would just say very, very briefly that we live today in challenging times, not only because of course, not just from a Jewish or Israeli perspective, but in terms of the nature of socio-political and cultural discourse in the Western world in general. A thing that is very, very visible in the North American continent, in Israel, and definitely many, many other parts of the Western world, where we see an alarming disparity between, on one hand, very high levels of access to information that people have, but a much lower ability to engage knowledge in depth. I call it a generation of surfers without a diving license. People surf and they don't necessarily dive anymore. And when you surf and don't dive, you become much more prone and susceptible to manipulation. The other concern that I have is something that one sees today all the way from the grassroots level and onto the highest levels of leadership. And that is, again, an opposite or an inverse relationship between very low levels of knowledge and very high levels of opinion. In other words, a lot of people have a lot to say about things they know nothing about. I remember being in New York about a year and a half ago. I just recently came back started traveling again, but as you can imagine, I was not traveling for almost a year and a half due to COVID. And on my last visit to the States in February 2020. I was in New York, and I opened a Wall Street Journal, and I remember seeing this cartoon, which pretty much summed it all up. It featured two senators arguing with one another over an issue of debate, and then one of them, in the heat of the discussion, says to his fellow senator, says the following thing in anger. He says, "And don't get me started on issues I know even less about." And that, in my opinion, is malaise that has infiltrated almost every level of social discourse today. So for me, for example, as a scholar, as an educator, I come and say a few things. Number one, the purpose of true education is not to teach people what to think, but rather how to think. And people are losing tools of how to think responsibly. Number two, in today's day and age, content is no longer the currency of education, because you can get content on this. Context is far more valuable a commodity in today's day and age than content, because context is what most people are missing today. So if you followed even my presentation with you today, 95% of it was context and not content. I want you to see a much bigger picture of understanding Israel from a bird's eye view. And the rest of the information about Israel you can get. You don't need me for that. The third point, when we talk about Israel, Ari, it is very, very important for me that Israel is understood as a state of ideals and not an ideal state. In other words, Israel never claimed to be an ideal state, but more importantly, there is no such a creature on earth called an ideal state. As a matter of fact, if you follow historical rhetoric, you'll see that without fail, any leader who uttered the word ideal state was by definition a non-democratic leader, either fascist, communist, or whatever else, but not a democratic leader. In other words, we need to contextualize the discussion about Israel. We need to set the parameters around that discussion, and we need to invest, and that's probably, and I'm going to talk about it in length, Ari, in the third session, what our, especially young generation, but not only the young generation, also our generation, is lacking the most. And I urge you, if you so will, to look at a recent piece that I wrote 4 months ago at Jewish Philanthropy, that basically says that the issue today among us, the issue is not the issues, so-called the issues, but the spiraling collapse in our ability to discuss them. What the Jewish people today miss the most are the actual safe and brave spaces to talk about controversial, sensitive issues without fear of being canceled, without fear of repercussion, without a sensation of guilt and shame. And this is even more so true on American campuses today, which are rapidly becoming the least landscape for intellectual honesty and for intellectual integrity, which is a trend that truly and honestly worries me very, very, very much. This is on one foot, and with your permission, I will return to this in much, much greater depth on the third session.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the next 2 sessions. In our remaining time, which is like 1 minute, but we'll give you some extra time a little bit. Can you tell us about what you do for Birthright and why you took this job and what you're seeing? I mean, I don't think students are there right now, but what you've seen, what kind of students are coming to Israel? What do they know? What do they not know? Many questions. Let's just start with, what do you do for Birthright?
Well, I've been the International Vice President of Education for Birthright Israel for the last 10 years. Prior to that, I was a professor of Jewish studies at Bar-Ilan College. Actually, Birthright called me to join literally a week after I was offered the tenure. So it was a hard decision, but I made that decision. It was the best decision I've made. To date, Birthright Israel has brought to Israel on a 10-day educational trip 750,000 participants from 68 countries worldwide. Every group meets Israelis that join the trip as participants. And in that respect, Birthright serves as a foundational bridge between young Israelis and young world Jews in order to establish this kind of reciprocal relationship. I can tell you that from our ongoing finger on the pulse of young Jewry in general and American young Jewry in particular, I can tell you that even at this day and age of inflammatory rhetoric and paralyzing polarization and junk food for thought that is being smeared all over social media, the overwhelming majority of American Jewish students are a silent majority in this cacophony of nonsense. However, what we should be concerned about is that this silent majority is starting to increasingly feel as a silenced minority. And that's where Birthright and other organizations need to enter, and Birthright is entering with full force, allowing young Jews to feel worthy in their Jewish skin, to feel worthy in their desire to visit Israel, and to understand, and that's our slogan, you got questions, we have context. Not we have answers, we have context. We want to push students to understand that if you want to truly have an open-minded about diverse narratives and diverse viewpoints, if you truly want to have an open mind, acquire a mind first. And the only way to acquire a mind is through experience and not through the rubbish that runs unhindered on social media. I'm optimistic, but this requires true partnership and alliances throughout the American Jewish community, and especially, and with that I'm going to conclude, especially an understanding in the Jewish community that unity among Jews has always been a value, whereas uniformity between Jews has never been a value. In other words, the fact that we disagree on many issues is not cause for breaking apart from each other. As a matter of fact, I can tell you that non-uniformity, disagreement, different opinions between Jews has always been a cause of celebration in the Jewish narrative. All the foundational books in the Jewish bookshelves were written based on disagreement between people, not agreement. And I challenge you, Ari, and everybody else in the audience, find me a single book, one book that was written by 10 rabbis who agreed with one another, and I will change my entire philosophy of life. There isn't such a book because it's boring. Disagreement, difference of opinions is the fuel that ignites Jewish life. What Judaism fears the most is not difference of opinions, but rather indifference, apathy, leaving the tent, leaving the discussion, leaving the table. That's why Birthright Israel and many other organizations make it their business to keep people in the discussion, and that should become a prime objective of all of us.
Thank you. And we at CSP fully agree, and are so happy that we've had you. It took 20 years to get you in CSP, but Zoom has allowed us to do a 3-part series with you live from your own house. We're sorry we missed you in LA. So you have to tell me when you're coming to LA, which we're based in Orange County, California. So we're just a few hours south. That's not a few hours, depending on traffic. It could be 45 minutes or less, but sometimes a few hours. Right. But thank you for sharing with us today. We look forward to your second session. Can you just give us a quick preview as to what you're doing next week, and then we'll break?
I'm sorry, I have so many lectures, I simply don't remember, to be honest with you.
I'll tell you. The topic is
just remind me. Oh, it's about Tisha B'Av. Yeah.
Why? Yeah, and you and I discussed, like, isn't it Hanukkah coming up? So why are we talking about Tisha B'Av?
Okay, why are we talking about Tisha B'Av in Hanukkah? Because as you can imagine now, after we've had the first session, I'm actually not going to talk about Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is just a prelude to actually discuss a much, much broader context of why Tisha B'Av has become such a foundational moment of memory in the Jewish narrative, and what are we actually crying about? Because I can tell you as a prelude, we are not crying about the destruction of the temple. Get that out of your system. It's something much, much bigger, for which the destruction of the temple is merely the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, so please tune in next week. Note, if you look at Steve Sholkoff's face, he's wearing a homemade CSP visor. He gets a lot of credit for doing that himself. However, if you go to our new CSP online store, you'll see we actually have an official CSP visor that is not from cut out pieces of lettering on a hat. And we've named it the Steve Sholkoff visor. So go to our store. I'll send you the link. You'll see I keep adding stuff. There's crazy stuff in there, but there is the Steve Sholkoff visor. So named after Steve, he's wearing his visor. He's showing it off. And Zohar will send you an item from our store sometime. If you want the Steve Sholkoff visor, not the original, but if the new version, you just tell me. In Israel, it's very sunny there. Okay, anyway. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Zohar.
Thank you very much for having me, and
you're welcome.
Have a great week.
Everybody, we'll see you soon. Take care, and lots to think about. Bye.